Okay. Hello, y'all. It is 4:01 p.m. Pacific. My name is Megan Ibarra, and I'm here to welcome you to a very informal discussion on mutual aid and abolitionist praxis and the Cops Off Campus movement. Grab your softest PJs, your coziest cocoa, and your headphones for what is hopefully your last Zoom of the day. First, some housekeeping. If possible, we ask that you leave your video and audio off to improve streaming quality for our panelists. This is also because it's not a full webinar, so this is a good way to make sure that the interpreters can be seen. Thanks to the campaign to decriminalize UW for organizing this panel. We are particularly grateful to the UW Departments of Comparative History of Ideas and Development, Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and Geography for covering accessibility costs, and to our sign language and real-time captioners for helping us meet our community's access needs. If you have questions you would like to pose to the panelists, please write them in the chat and I will do my best to moderate and offer up questions at the end of their discussion. Okay, so we are here for Dean Spade's latest book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next, which shares lessons from his decades working in movements to build queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice. Also with us, Angélica Cházaro, a law professor who is currently focused on her work as a core organizer with Decriminalize Seattle and the Coalition to Replace Punitive Policing with community-based public safety programs. Last but not least, Chandan Reddy, UW professor and core organizer with Decriminalize UW, a call to defund armed campus policing and invest in community health resources and intellectual communities of color. You can learn more about the campaign to decriminalize UW at decriminalizeuw.com. If you'd like to join us for a discussion about this work, you can meet us at our teach-in, which is this Thursday, December 3rd from 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific. Real-time captioning will be provided. Registration is required. So to join the discussion, please sign up at tinyurl.com/decrim teach-in. I've just pasted the link into the chat. Okay, so here's the book. Yay! When this little orange gem came to my door, I needed it so much. As a high-risk COVID shut-in, I missed my community, the rallies, the marches, even, sadly, the drama. I have reveled in having these amazing panelists as friends in common cause, to shut down bunkers posing as police stations, youth jails, immigrant detention centers, and to build up our collective power through the strength of supportive relationships. I've been thinking a lot about a variation of Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore's question, what will we do when we win? Which is, who will we be when we win? For every end to a state of state violence, like a youth jail, we need a foundation to relationships that address these harms and to support each other. Dean's book came out right as our campus community was beginning to ask questions. Wait, how many campus cops do we have? Why are they on a joint terrorism task force? Why do cops make more money than professors? Even as we launched a petition with demands that the University of Washington take steps towards non-reformist reforms, or to stop paying money to criminalize people of color and those experiencing houselessness near our campus, Dean's book reminded me that this is just the beginning of our work. Yes, historically white universities are the ivory tower. Also, we are campus communities, and we need to be accountable to our students, workers, and neighbors. Even as the administration assured us that we needed armed police to respond to students experiencing suicidal ideations, or folks raiding departmental fridges for lunches, the work of people like Dean Spade reminds us that we have to address the root causes. Why do people need leftovers? Why are our students in crisis? Even as folks in power want to consolidate their power during crisis, whether the mayor of Seattle or the president of our university, the rest of us need to build community across our divisions. Dean Spade's book on mutual aid, or the radical act of caring for each other, helps us think about how to remake ourselves as we work to change the world. I am delighted for a wide-ranging conversation, and I hope that y'all can help us stay grounded in the ways that campuses are communities too. which is why the call to disarm UW's police department is actually directly linked to the call to increase funding for mental health support for our campus community and to increase Black Studies courses. So I didn't do big introductions, and I'll leave it to all of you to introduce yourselves more if you feel like you need to. For now, I will let Dean Spade take it away and share a little bit more about the book for those of us who don't have this little orange lovely with us and have read it. Dean, take it away.
Thanks so much, Megan. Thank you to the interpreters and the captioner and all the departments and organizers that support this event, and especially to Megan for organizing us and for those really kind words about the book and that really thoughtful perspective on how we can directly understand the relationship between the COPS off-campus work that's happening on so many campuses and mutual aid and the kinds of abolition work that we've all been involved in Seattle and more broadly. And so many thanks to Angélica and Chandan for being willing to have this conversation with me today. These people are two of my most revered teachers whose work has deeply informed mine, both as scholars and activists doing abolitionist work, including mutual aid, and just people who deeply inspire me and who show me what it is to be generous, thoughtful, principled, and caring in these really difficult times and struggles that we're all in. So as Megan said, I'm just going to say a few words about what's in this book in case people haven't gotten to see it yet before we talk about some of the ideas. And Chandan inspired me to also share some of the critiques that I've been hearing of the book, because I think that's kind of fun. Like, what have people been saying? So I'll share some of those at the end too. So essentially, in this book, I treat the term mutual aid, which is used to mean a lot of different things by different people. I treat it as meaning survival work that we do based in shared understanding that systems that exist now are not meeting our needs and are actually causing the crises that we're facing. And I talk about how mutual aid has three key benefits for social movements. First, meeting people's immediate survival needs. Second, that mutual aid work is generally an on-ramp to social movement participation. Most people join social movements or encounter them because they're coming to like the mutual aid door of the movement in need, or because they're having an urgent desire to support people through something they've been through or something they're worried people are going through. Most people joining social movements like want to immediately help others and to get the immediate help they need. And so it's the entry point through which a lot of people join and then grow a broader solidarity, sometimes take more bold actions, get into root causes work. And the third thing is that mutual aid work builds the world we actually want to live in and the practices we need to live in it. It's us providing the things we need to each other and practicing collective self-determination and collaboration. Mutual aid is just one tactic in a broader social movement ecosystem. And it's essential that what I'm talking about are movements that are seeking to get to the root causes of crisis, root causes like extractive economic systems, the existence of prisons and borders, et cetera. And so mutual aid also supports lots of different pieces of the work, right? Like when we see people who are trying to shut down detention centers and prisons and jails all around the country, including in our region, those people are also always doing direct support to the people inside those facilities and to the communities facing imprisonment in those facilities, right? Those things go together, trying to get rid of the prison and supporting the criminalized people. Or when we see people organizing strikes, whether it's tenant strikes or strikes of workers, those people are also always supporting the strikers to survive, right? While organizing those confrontations. mutual aid as part of direct confrontations with landlords, bosses, cops, whether that's, medics in the streets supporting people this summer, fighting cops, or whatever it is. So it's both part of the riskier, bolder work, and it's also like the constant work because of the impact of these crises in our communities. Sorry if you can hear my dog crying. So this book basically does two things. The first part of it is about the importance of mutual aid to building social movements. And the second part of it is about specific models and approaches for some of the pitfalls that confront mutual aid work, like burnout, conflict, difficulty making decisions together, and all the stuff where we're trying not to replicate the hierarchical systems most of us are used to working in. A lot of us have seen ways that groups we're part of fall into dysfunction because we've been living in systems of patriarchy and white supremacy and ableism and capitalism, and all of that comes out between us when we work together. And so we have overworking, or we have people dominating, or people being overly passive, or moving too fast and taking on a bunch of work that we can't complete, or flaking. Just so many versions of conflict and harm that can come up in groups. And so a lot of this book is also about those patterns and ways through those patterns. So to get to the critiques, I'll just give a few of them that I have heard. One is that some people have surfaced, kind of don't we need a big centralized organized state when we face disaster, like whether climate change induced weather disasters or pandemics. The idea being that only the state has the capacity to deliver relief at these levels. And I have a few brief responses to that. One is, I think we can see when we look at climate-induced disasters that like FEMA actually doesn't have capacity to support people, because you often need local knowledges to address local disasters. And so that we've seen, like with the history of Occupy Sandy, or so many other contexts, that FEMA just shows up late to give loans to people, to not even give real support. I think so. I would question whether or not the state has actual capacity to meet disasters. We also see, the incredible limits of anything provided by the government. So like the CARES Act not being renewed, and they can just stop giving the unemployment benefits whenever, and not give them to many certain kinds of workers. And it all goes through the state unemployment systems that are really uneven and really impossible to get through for many people. That all relief that comes through state programs has always been racialized, moralizing, excluding, and contractible. They can take it back as soon as the uprising or crisis is over. It's designed to be inadequate so that it'll force people back to work as soon as possible. There's a pretty overt debate about that right now in Congress. And so, our desire, the desire of people doing mutual aid, is to build more capacity to provide everything that everybody needs. When there are moments of concessions from the government, where some kind of relief unrolls, we can celebrate those concessions, but we still have to fill in all the gaps of the people they're not covering, and when they take it back. So this relates to the second critique, which is, isn't this idea of mutual aid aligned with neoliberal aims of volunteerism, shrinking the welfare state, increasing precarity for low-income people and workers, and having basically no safety net? And I would say, yes, we have a critique of the welfare state, and so do they. But that's where the similarity ends, right? Because the sort of right-wing or neoliberal version of that is that they want to tear down welfare state mechanisms to the extent they exist, but maintain private property regimes for extraction, and the militaries and cops and borders that facilitate that extraction. Whereas we are trying to wildly undo that human created maldistribution that concentrates wealth, and get rid of prisons and borders and extractive economic arrangements. And so our work to survive the current crisis is aimed at building decentralized ways to survive based in principles of collective self-determination, not stabilizing the current extraction. And some people have this hope that a welfare state will show up and provide everybody everything they need and not be racist and colonial and sexist and ableist. And I don't see evidence of that anywhere. But also, even if you hope that could exist, it's certainly not coming soon. Like, there's no evidence that the Biden-Harris administration or anything else we have on board is about to meet us with meaningful responses to these crises. They are giving every indication otherwise. So regardless, we're going to need to take care of each other and organize together. The third critique that I'll mention is that, can't mutual aid fall into charity dynamics? Can't it be co-opted by the state? They either take credit for it and say everything's being taken care of, or can't it be kind of defanged and framed as like supplemental to what business is doing and what government is doing? And the answer is, of course. That's why we rigorously practice trying to create mutual aid that is oppositional and is tied to root causes focused tactics of many kinds. And there are no guarantees that when we take up mutual aid work, those things won't happen unless we actively practice them, which I think there's been a long history of movements thinking deeply about what criteria for practices of mutual aid address that. And so, I think those critiques are already inherent in mutual aid practice to me. So with that, I will turn it over to my friends to give some thoughts.
Thank you, Dean, for that. Just also want to start by thanking Megan for organizing this, getting us together. There have been very few reasons to celebrate this year, this terrible, terrible, difficult portal of a year. But this book to me really is a reason to celebrate, this act of creation, Dean, of you pulling together so much of what you've been thinking about for so long and having it be an offering that we literally can hold physically in our hands just feels like such a gift. So thank you. Thank you to the interpreters and the captioners. I also want to just start with an acknowledgement that we are on the traditional land of the Duwamish, and I've been thinking about what it actually means to organize alongside the descendants of the original inhabitants of this land. And so in thinking about today, I was thinking about the work that I've been part of with Solidarity Budget, which was an effort where a lot of different movement orgs and individuals got together to push through a city budget that for the first time shrank rather than grew the police budget. And the Duwamish tribe signed onto it. And so I want to read their statement signing onto it. Chairwoman Cecile Hansen signs on behalf of the Duwamish tribe, the first people to experience homelessness in Seattle, a direct result of the Native American ban passed by City Council in 1865. This city has a long history of authorizing policy that perpetuates inequities and displaces communities of color. It is time to choose a new path, one that leads to justice and housing for all of our neighbors. So I'll start with that. And then, Dean, I feel like I could talk about this for many hours, and I probably will with you at some point after this. But there were three big things I wanted to touch on today. One, just gratitude for your digging into a definition of what mutual aid is, because I feel like it's become such a sort of a wishy-washy term that's being sort of slapped on anything during this time of great need. And so, it's been making me think about mutual aid as this sort of organized recognition, as opposed to the government's organized abandonment of all of our communities. And so people who are pursuing mutual aid projects right now are recognizing each other, literally just looking at you and seeing you as a person who needs food, water, housing, childcare, organizing to provide it to each other, all the while pointing to the fact that the state has abandoned people in many cases to their death. So that it's not a person's individual moral failing, it's systemic design that has abandoned people to their deaths. And the example here that to me has been most moving has been the work of COVID-19 mutual aid in Seattle. that has organized recognition of people in prisons, you know, that people are dying of multiple outbreaks. You know, there's one works release site here called Bishop Lewis that's literally a block from Harborview Hospital that has had 6 outbreaks this year alone. That COVID is being passed from our state prisons to our immigration detention centers because of the governor's refusal to stop transfers. And that we need to organize a recognition of the life of people in prison, and we have to do it in a way that also calls out the abandonment of them to the ravages of COVID and the ravages of incarceration, which is also organized by the state. So clearly Governor Inslee is like capable of decreeing various levels, you know, tiers or whatever, I don't know which one we're in right now, of like shutdown of businesses, of deciding what is and isn't an essential business. But he's also very clearly decided like what is and isn't an essential life. And for me, you know, COVID-19 mutual aid, the family members of people in prison are pushing back and saying, yes, you know, these lives are essential to us and we will continue organizing to push back. And so, you know, that definition that you provided of like organizing for recognition of somebody's life and having that politicized pushback on the abandonment by the state is so crucial in my own understanding of mutual aid. The other thing, and hopefully we can talk about this more together, is this question of scale, you know. And so for me, this falls into sort of different categories when I think about scale and mutual aid. One is, I think what you started talking about is like the harm of scale, you know, like the harm of having someone like FEMA come in and at scale actually, you know, leave people in some cases like worse off than they were before with loans they can never repay. But I've also been thinking about the ways in which like cruelty is very easily scalable. Coercion is very easily scalable, like an utter disregard for the planet's well-being is easily scalable. You know, so your book gives the example of like, you know, how we're all dependent on power grids that are controlled by like 1 or 2 or 3 large companies, and how Naomi Klein talks about having microgrids would be much actually safer and better for all of us. You know, and in my work with Decriminalize Seattle, pushing back on, you know, trying to defund the police here, you know, the question we got, continue to receive so much is like, can you show us that you now have scaled this alternative to policing so that we can justify cutting the police budget, which by the way has expanded to like respond to so many police problems. And it's very helpful for me to like clarify why I just like reject that question rather than like jumping through every hoop to like scale up the one mega nonprofit that can be like, we are a civilian 911, you know, is to think about scale in a different way, which is, you know, a labor strike that becomes a factory strike, like a scaling up our tactics, or scaling up ways for people to be involved. But that doesn't mean that, you know, programs themselves become like systematized. So like in some ways, like avoiding scale, avoiding like legibility or almost like governability by the state feels so important in this moment, particularly when we're just being asked to like replicate a harmful state function at scale. I think there's also like the question of like what we're scaling up. And so like when literally people of Seattle are being asked to scale up a 911 response, you know, I think about the example you give of the Oakland Power Project, scaling up the response to crises, you know, treating people like gunshot wounds or like people who are having a diabetic crisis so that they don't have to call 911. But I also think there's like another scaling up where, you know, at least here, city council and the mayor are pushing to have this exact civilian replication of 911, but really trying hard not to look at the fact that we wouldn't need 911 if everyone had housing or if everyone had access to mental health care. And so it's like what we're actually trying to scale up really changes depending, you know, if you're coming from the mutual aid point of view versus not. And then finally, the question of like why we're being asked to scale up. You know, now more than ever, people I think are open to this idea because the Trump administration has revealed the cruelty of immigration detention that was always there in new ways. People are asking, you know, yes, maybe it is time to end immigration detention, but what should we replace it with? And again, you know, I think that's the wrong question because the answer that's being given a lot is, well, you know, this like nonprofit model that will take over case management of people being managed through their deportation. And like, yeah, that's definitely a better answer than being locked up in a detention center where you might die of COVID or something else. But it's still like the answer to the wrong question. You know, the right question that I think coming from like a mutual aid perspective would be like, why should we be managing other people's movements at all? You know, your insights about collective self-determination, I think would lead us to a whole other sets of questions. Like what right do we have to manage other people's movement based solely on the accident of our birth, or giving the US's role in extracting so much from the world and yet expecting these like utterly impermeable borders. You know, the questions change when you're starting to think about collective self-determination. And then finally, I'll skip over this part. I guess I've also been thinking a lot about how helpful it is to think about the role of mutual aid in like boldness and people taking bold action together and breaking norms, because we are so strongly, you know, disciplined into these norms of just like not rocking the boat because of literally like the armed police state, but also just, you know, from the ways in which like when you start school, like, you know, that if you break a rule, you're going to get kicked out of school or expelled. And like, you know, now thinking back, I'm like, that would have been great. But like at the time, it's like the worst horror. So, but the ways in which, you know, support and solidarity enables bold action. And so I'm thinking about this like in the immigrant justice sphere, where like the moment in which like just like ordinary people came together during the Obama administration to do like massive shutdown actions of detention centers, at least the one here, the people inside detention seeing and hearing that just like ordinary folks who were not immigration attorneys, who were not, you know, I don't know, elected officials, who were just like people being like, what's happening there is not okay. And it has nothing to do with the merits, legal or not, of your case. We think there should be not one more deportation, is what led folks inside to be willing to take the bold action of going on like mass hunger strike, which has led us now to a point, you know, nearly 7 years later, where we're hopefully on the route to shutting down that detention facility. You know, and I think about when I worked as an attorney in the detention facility representing people, those were not the discussions we were able to have ever, because I was there to like represent them on their individual case. And so like even like the radical imagination of being like, hey, but do you think you should even be here at all? Should anyone be detained? Like, shouldn't we shut this place down? Like that wasn't a conversation we could have. But in a mutual aid model where, you know, we're deprofessionalizing immigration support, where regular people, many of them undocumented, are trying to shut down detention centers, then it just like opens up a new type of imagination and makes a possibility for new demands. So I will pause there and hand it over to Chandan, but thank you so much for this offering, Dean.
Thanks, Angélica. And of course, I want to just add my thanks to all the organizers, and especially Megan, for bringing us together, and the interpreters for making this conversation accessible. And I want to especially thank, of course, Dean for writing this really, really necessary and timely intervention and book. And I recommend everyone go and listen to the Barnard Center for Women YouTube clip, or I'm not sure what we call them, podcast of Dean Spade talking with two of his comrades, Miriam Kaba, and who was the, I'm having a moment of—
Jairus Dixon.
Yes, and Jairus from Safe Outside the System, doing other things now, but Out of Your Lord Project, because they had a really rich and fascinating conversation, and an important one. And Angélica just put it in the chat. And so I thought that maybe one thing we could do with the time, I'm not going to speak for too long because we really want to be in a conversation, but I wanted to kind of build on some of the things that were talked about in that conversation, to kind of use Dean's book as a way to continue conversations among communities of organizers. And I think that one of the things that emerges is this question of, why does the book feel so timely? Why does everyone feel like this is exactly the right book for right now? For folks who don't know Dean, ironically, Dean has been working on mutual aid and writing about mutual aid for at least a decade now. Sort of during the Obama administration time. And in fact, the Big Door Brigade, which is Dean's website that lists all kinds of mutual aid projects that are happening all over the country, the US empire, and the planet, that was started when the Trump election, the election between after Obama's residency in the White House, it was during that period of the election that Dean started the Big Door Brigade, knowing that both neoliberalism and the potential of Trumpian fascism required the same answer, which was mutual aid in terms of what our communities needed to address their needs, and that their needs were going to become intensified, their vulnerabilities were going to become intensified by both systems. So I wanted to just think a little bit about the timeliness of Dean's book, and his cover really kind of captures this, where he talks about surviving this crisis, and he puts in parentheses "and the next." And one of the things that we know is that capitalism produces crises as an endemic aspect of itself. So crises are not actually crises in capitalist life and capitalist society are not actually aberrations or exceptions. They're routinized and systemic to the logic of capital, but they are contradictory. And so mutual aid actually emerges from the contradiction of capitalism in the way in which it is driven and is crisis prone. And as Dean mentioned, the welfare state was one attempt to resolve that tendency of capital for profit to drop, and the mass unemployment that happens, the different forms of social insurance that are required to handle the organization of society for the production of profit, and so forth. So there are very structural dynamics that produce the need for mutual aid, and is why we're going to always see mutual aid coming up again and again and again as long as we live in a capitalist society. And the example that Dean offers in his book that's really powerful is the example, of course, of the Black Panther Party and their breakfast program. And I think that that's a great example for our moment, because it shows that the crisis of capitalism isn't just an economic crisis in a sense of how we might think of class, but it's always also a racial and gendered crisis and contradiction. So, you know, if we think about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's sense that racism is group differentiated vulnerability, that's not exceptional to capitalism, that is capitalism. So you're going to see communities organizing mutual aid to handle the fact that racism is a capitalist racism, if we want to call it that, is group differentiated vulnerability, premature death. And mutual aid really comes out of that structural condition of capitalism. But in addition to the structural conditions of capitalism, I think that Dean's book feels so timely because of the historical moment and the historical contradictions. Dean and we were talking a little earlier, and Dean and I were both remarking that we learned of mutual aid work and learned how to do mutual aid work, and of the kind of radical possibilities of mutual aid in building social movements through our work and through our exposure to work by activists in the HIV movement back in the 1980s and early 90s. And I think that that's an important sort of element to the conversation, because historically, mutual aid is emerging in this moment as the state continues to retreat from offering any kind of social provision, from offering any kind of reasonable social reproduction, from offering any kind of meaningful welfare state. This often goes by the name of neoliberalism, but what Dean's work tracked in his prior work was the way in which what emerged in the place of the state, in the domain of kind of private civil society, was a kind of massive expansion of the nonprofit industry. And he's sort of posing mutual aid as a response to nonprofitization of our social existence. And by that, I really mean that nonprofits are doing a lot of the social reproduction work, from housing to food to healthcare, et cetera, that used to be taken up by the state at different moments. And it depoliticizes us when those things are taken up in that way. But the reason I bring this up is because I think that HIV activism offers a kind of maybe a point of entry for a conversation, which is on the one hand, activists used mutual aid as a way of providing the needs for one another. And in doing so, they oftentimes had to break with the codes of the law and the fabrications of the law. So people had to share medicines that weren't allowed to be shared with each other. We oftentimes smuggled medicines between countries when we traveled. You oftentimes had to not disclose certain kinds of information to be able to get into institutional spaces. You had to also provide all kinds of social needs for one another. And those became a central part of the movement work. And they built up movement capacities, including something like Treatment Action Group, which actually started making demands on pharmacies and private pharma. And so it's not like mutual aid can't interact with large-scale capitalist corporations and entities like pharma, because I do think that Treatment Action Group is a great example of ways in which we've been able to, people have been able to do that. These are ordinary people who taught themselves the science to be able to refute what Big Pharma was saying about HIV medications and treatments and therapies, and were able to demand community review boards and community mechanisms for getting the kinds of medications and therapies that people needed sooner and faster, and by the sort of terms of science and health, and not by the terms of profit and the release of patents. And so on the one hand, we see all the ways in which mutual aid build this up. On the other hand, what we saw in places like New York and Los Angeles and so forth was that these forms of mutual aid, when they were institutionalized, became things like the Gay Men's Health Center, GMHC, or the Gay and Lesbian Center of New York, or other entities. And instantaneously, communities of color went from being participants in mutual aid to becoming consumers of social service. And so what we saw in New York was that we were forcibly demobilized. And folks of color were folks of color in communities that were having some of the highest HIV transmissions were being turned into clients and into cases that had case managers and no longer participants in a mutual aid effort. And Dean's book really addresses this dynamic and really calls and shows that we need to rebuild our capacities for collective action and for the collective delivering of our needs, precisely because of the ways in which nonprofitization is constantly transforming our inherent relationships into these asymmetrical relationships of provider and client, et cetera. And so the Audre Lorde Project, which is a group that I was a part of, and Ijiris in the Barnard group was also a part of, and the Barnard conversation was also a part of ALP, really actually started because organizers of color, particularly gay men of color who were in HIV organizations, saw that all of the money that the state was giving was going to these large community-based organizations like GMHC, but the money was being dispersed for the social reproduction of communities of color. All of the infection was in communities of color, and communities of color weren't getting any of the money for themselves, only to be clients for these larger organizations that were primarily run by white gay men at that time. And so the Audre Lorde Project, I think, is an example of an effort to keep mutual aid and collective mobilization alive in the context of this constant dialectic between community organizing and its formalizing into both capitalist forms or statist forms. And so I was wondering if maybe we could talk a little bit about tactics, if we're going to all be involved in mutual aid work, and we all need to, because the crises are endemic, and we know that there are more pandemics on the way, we know that climate change is happening, and we know that the state has abandoned folks. How do we tactically produce the mechanisms to to keep mutual aid politicized and to connect it to movement work. And so one thing that I know Angélica has done, and I'd love for her to talk about this, is that I thought was really brilliant about Decriminalize Seattle was that it hasn't just asked for monies to be distributed to communities of color and immigrant communities and to other communities that have been historically targeted by policing, but it said that you can't do that unless you also withdraw the apparatuses of violence from our communities. So it tied withdrawing police violence to mutual aid. And I think it's those kinds of unexpected connections that are really important so that we disorganize some of the ways that both the state and the private sector want to create the concept of or want to appropriate our work in mutual aid. So I'm just wondering if either of you want to talk about that.
I'm happy to give it a try, and thank you for that, Chandan. I feel like that rich history of really the movement to address and to like value the life of people living with HIV is such key context here. Yeah, and thinking of the local example, I mean, it's so tricky, right? Because we're making this demand of the state, of the city of Seattle, defund the police by 50% and transfer that money into community hands. But even that moment of transfer, you know, we have to be like, well, what would that actually look like? And that's where the demand to engage in participatory budgeting came in, because it was the only way we could think of to make it so that it wasn't the same people who had no problem funding the police department, you know, for 150 years, you know, billions and billions of dollars, would now all of a sudden be the ones to have the ideas of like where this money should go instead. And so it was a demand to both withdraw that money and then to put that money in the hands of people to decide what kinds of projects would actually generate safety. And then also a demand to say, to even organize participatory budgeting, we need to have a survey of the people most impacted by policing about what would actually generate safety for them. So we even know what buckets to create for participatory budgeting. And so that's where the Black Brilliance research that's being held and led by King County Equity Now is in, you know, with like 7 organizations that are all Black led, over 100 organizers who have become researchers into what generates safety, to even lay the groundwork for a participatory budgeting effort. But ultimately, you know, we're in this moment now where the budget has passed and the city agencies that are run by a mayor who's very opposed to the movement to defund the police and have people power to redistribute the money, is now in charge of the agencies that will do the city side of that process. And so it's still, you know, there's this tremendous tension of like, who from the city side will hold this process, what blocks will be put in place once everyone in Seattle, because everyone can have a voice in deciding where the money goes, decides where the money should go. How is that actually implemented, particularly if the city agencies who hold the contracts to give this out are agencies like the Human Services Department and others, which have like a really long track record of having very, very difficult contracting processes that sort of mimic many of the problems for the nonprofit sector that Dean talks about in the book. And so, you know, I just feel there's like minefields everywhere, but so much of this effort is just like trying to put a wrench, at least in the processes of the state that is so good at doling out like cruelty and surveillance and supervision of our bodies and bodies of Black people in particular. And then putting those same folks who've been impacted by that surveillance in charge of flipping the script while somehow not being co-opted. You know, so it feels like a state of constant hypervigilance. And that's where like having these developed mutual aid groups to have some of that burden and to have some of the groundwork laid makes it seem like it's a possibility, but really it's just a gigantic experiment.
I would love to add to that, and just building off of, I mean, one thing, just, it's a complicated contradiction potentially that we are, like the only reason we have to seek this process of divest, invest is because of this prior extractive process that takes all of our, you know, labor and builds this whole taxation system that's crappy and really uneven and you know, regressive, and then puts all that money in the cops. Like there's so many things that were taken from everyone's communities, and so that everyone doesn't have housing and doesn't have child. Like, so like, I just feel like that's the backdrop context that we're digging our way out of. And this, I think, is a really bold experiment in that. Chandan's remarks made me remember this whole period in New York where may not remember it exactly right, but it was like the work we were doing, it was the late 90s, and the work we were doing was about the ways, New York City has like a welfare system, and then there's actually some very specific benefits in that system for people living with HIV and AIDS that are not the same in most cities. It's a very specific fought because of the fight of activists there. And so things like you're supposed to be able to not go to a congregate shelter, but instead get a private room if you're immunocompromised, and things like that make a lot of sense. But of course, none of it, people don't actually get it, and it's all terrible. So I was involved in the fight when a lot of what we were doing was stuff like we would camp out at the office of the city office that's supposed to give out housing, and we wouldn't let them close until they made sure people had housing assignments. So it was just really complicated, and other things, we're chaining ourselves to the fronts of the welfare building and whatever, But what's interesting about it was that it was mutual aid work, because it was about individual people getting a room that night. It was also work to try to make this thing give people what it's supposed to give. It used bold tactics where we sometimes get arrested or things like that. It wasn't, and it took risks in those ways. And also we were constantly in a dilemma. Like, are we just making the system work? Do we kind of like work for free for this city agency, forcing them to house these people each night? And I think I just want to name a couple other examples of that dilemma that is a real dilemma in mutual aid. Another example I was just thinking about, visiting our mutual friend, Andrea Parra, who used to live in Seattle and work at NERP, and then lives in Bogota. And when I went with her she was doing legal work inside this jail in Bogota, and the jail was like super disorganized, and the jail itself didn't know when it was supposed to let people out. So it loved that she and her interns and stuff would do all the paperwork and prove when someone was supposed to get out, because actually the jail didn't really know. And so then she's like, wait, am I administering a jail now? So that was another, it's wonderful to get people out, yay. But also what's going on here? Are we supplementing? The third example is bail funds. I'm putting in the chat this statement from when the Brooklyn Bail Fund decided to close. This is a huge dilemma happening around the country where bail funds are an obvious example of mutual aid. I'm sorry, I've been speaking too quickly. So the dilemma is, what if our bail fund just becomes supplemental to a system of continuing to arrest and cage people? And in New York, there had been some bail reform that was inadequate, that kind of assumed this bail fund would keep bailing out the people left out of the bail reform. And this bail fund was like, uh-oh, the system now relies on us as part of its functioning. I think this question, this doesn't mean mutual aid work is bad. It just means it's rigorous. It's the question of how not to get defanged is persistent. The question of how to do the divest, invest work with the police budget is no, we're not trying to build a social services nonprofit that polices people in some other way using social workers instead of people in police uniforms. No, but we are trying to move from having the current way the city budget works, that goes mostly to cops and is decided by a set of people, very small set of people, to having people practice collective self-determination through participatory budgeting, which may or may not work well and really depends on how it's done, like everything else. And people like Angélica and many others thinking very carefully about that. And so I think the point to me, this just like abolition. In abolition, we're just trying to remember all the dilemmas and pitfalls all the time and debate them and use them to guide us and experiment and fail and learn the other side's response, captured our work in this concerning way. And mutual aid is the same way. It's not like, oh, this will just help everything. It's it's going to depend on how we do it. If we're doing a housing program and we're also saying you can't come in unless you're sober, then we're just reproducing charity models, or there's a million sort of pitfalls that I think we're engaging with.
Oh, go ahead, Angélica.
No, you Chandan. You first.
Well, I'll be quick, which is Dean's remarks remind me of a couple things too about the New York period that I just wanted to lift up. And I think it comes to this question about positioning mutual aid as a movement tactic and not as an end in of itself. One, is one of the reasons we all are really craving mutual aid and why it's so useful and why this book is so important is because I think it helps us, it helps people who are invested in movement work move between movements. So, you know, work that's happening in mutual aid, for example, with COVID-19, was the vector that produced the structure needed to corral the spontaneous uprising that happened a couple months later, and just give it visibility, so that the spontaneous uprising against the murder of Black lives had an infrastructure for some of the things that it demanded through the COVID-19 mutual aid. And then that work shifted immediately towards thinking about people in detention as well as people in prison. And so there's a way in which if you do mutual aid and you learn the method of mutual aid, you are able to move between movements, which is what we really need right now for a variety of reasons. And I think that in the New York context of the early 90s, so there's sort of two things on the left. Like one, nationalism seems to be back and I don't really understand why. And then number two, on the left, you know, there was a critique of us who did mutual aid back in the 90s and early 2000s that came from a certain Marxist left that believed that the problem with mutual aid was that we were continuing to make social reproduction unwaged work. And that we shouldn't allow, it's what Dean was just saying about, you know, are we going to really allow the state to just appropriate all of our work? And Dean has the great example in his book of Hurricane Sandy, where, you know, Occupy Wall Street, which organized right before Hurricane Sandy, was targeted by the Department of Homeland Security and was put into legal proceedings by the Department of Homeland Security. Then a year later, it reorganizes itself as Occupy Sandy, and it becomes the largest, not just the largest mutual aid effort, but the largest effort in the area to provide the needs for people. And you actually had people from Homeland Security sort of speaking laudatory of Occupy Sandy as they were prosecuting Occupy Wall Street. And so I think that one of the things that it reminds me of is that I understand that the sort of Marxist and left critique. On the other hand, the reasons that those of us who are people of color and diasporic people were invested in some of the work around mutual aid and people who are in multiracial collectives like Audre Lorde Project, where there are Black folks, Indigenous folks, and Asians and Latinx, was that we wanted to decouple the state from the cultural order. And so we knew that we needed to devolve the state. If the state continues to expand, it also expands its categories of organization. And those are the categories that fabricate the belief that the law is right and so forth. And we were really trying to say, if we don't uncouple our social needs from the state, we will not be able to undermine nationalism and these ways that our lives are told to us to be organized and segregated from one another that isn't actually accurate. So I think a lot of us who are doing diasporic work, we're really turning to mutual aid as a way of trying to think beyond the nation state, and knowing that we need to do an active, part of the movement has to be a work to undo structures, not just to keep on expanding the nation state structures that we have. But I know Angélica has a lot of comments on this, so.
No, I can barely follow that with something equally useful, but I will try. And this is so helpful. We should do this more often. I guess I was thinking about when Dean and you, Chandan, as well, were talking about the ways in which if you're doing mutual aid, you can't help but see other crises. Like it's like an automatic de-siloing in a way that nonprofits encourage you to sort of stay in your silo. And so that like, if we want to like act intersectionally, the best way to do that is to be involved in a mutual aid project. Because there's no way to stick to like, I'm only looking at this one, you know, person who's in a prison right now, but I'm not seeing their family over here, or I'm not seeing the economic impacts that it's having, you know, losing their income to their family, or I'm not seeing the fact that they are lacking mental health care, or, you know, all of those things. You can't help but start putting the pieces together. And so like just the uses of intersectionality, you know, like intersectionality has become such a buzzword, but like I think like acting and organizing in ways that honor the insights of intersectionality really that can really grow from mutual aid organizing. And then also, Dean, what you were saying about like sort of like experimenting and the need for experimentation, and that all of this is just like sort of wild experimenting. What I like about that is that it sort of encourages us to like act outside of like fear and these purity politics, so that it's not just that like we can take bold actions together and break norms when we're doing mutual aid work, but also that like we can break our own like inner like, oh, but what if I mess up, or what if I do it wrong, or what if, you know, like all of that kind of gets pushed to the side when you're like, you know, it doesn't matter because this person is rotting in a prison, so I'm gonna do the thing and like try to do it well. And we haven't talked as much about the second half of the book, but like that to me, just because you're experimenting and like throwing everything at the wall doesn't mean that you're not going to do it in line with like a certain set of values, or in line with a certain set of like expectations of how we treat each other. And that's where like the second half of your book, that's literally like a how-to. And I heard, you know, somebody in another one of the you know, many awesome webinars that have been about your book, talking about the list of like all the mistakes I've ever made. You know, I was like, oh yes, like here's everything, you know, we've all sort of done wrong. And like the fact that you've put that all together, and the like, hey, in these moments of experimentation, when we understand that capitalism is the crisis and yet we're acting within it, pushing against it, and trying to help each other survive, here's some things to think about how to structure that work so that we don't end up inadvertently throwing each other away or replicating the harm that we see outside within our groups. Like that is so important. So it's like this rigorous yet bold experimentation. It's like you know that you don't know what you're doing, because no one does, because what we've had, at least in Seattle, is 150 years of a city council whose literally first law they passed was to render the presence of the Duwamish illegal, and like, you know, it's kind of been downhill from there. And so we're trying to reverse something that's so deeply entrenched, knowing we're going to have to experiment, you know, and hold each other's humanity through it. And I feel like the book is such a helpful guide for like holding both the ideas of it and then the practice of that.
Okay, internet overlord here with chat question for Dean Spade that builds off Angélica's comments. What are the key differences between charity and mutual aid? How do we think about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, in general, when I think about this, I think about like the old, centuries old history of charity in Europe is like Christians, Catholics giving alms to the poor to buy their way into heaven, and always being like about who are the deserving poor. And that's the history of different kinds of charity and what we might call social services programs in the US too. And so they've always been like, you know, the first sort of welfare type programs in the US were to give money to white widows of, you know, war veterans people who died in war, because we want to like, literally it was like about maintaining the white race, you know. And so it's always been and you know, about who is the deserving lives, who should be lifted up and supported. And so the way that looks in the day-to-day now is like, you're only eligible for the housing if you're sober, or you don't have any felony penalties on your record, or you have immigration status, or you do have kids, or you don't have kids, or whatever. Like charity models, whether it's being done by the government or by nonprofits, distinguishes the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and reifies stigma of the most stigmatized poor people, and reifies the idea that people are poor because something's wrong with them, except these few exceptional ones, and they'll get care. And then also people who are poor need to be worked on. So there's an idea like, you should take a budgeting class or a parenting class in order to get this housing, or in order to access these benefits. And so charity blames poor people for the crises they're in, whereas mutual aid blames the system and says that everybody should have what they want with no strings attached and no special eligibility criteria that's like, you can have it and you can't. So those are some of the basics. In the chart, in the book, I have kind of like a chart that looks at some of the typical tendencies on each side. But those are kind of the very basic pieces. I just want to also say one small thing to follow up on the conversation we were just having, which is that mutual aid's overwhelming. There's so much need. There's so many people in prisons and detention centers. There's such great poverty. There's no childcare. You know, it's rough out there. There's nothing for people during this pandemic, basically. And And to me, so people are like, this is so scary. How do I even begin? And we're all going to burn out. And I feel like the key thing is like, we just need a lot more people doing this together. And so a lot of what the second half of the book is about is how do we make groups that people can join? And how do we make a lot of groups that have a lot of different internal subcultures and local ways of doing it wisely and learn from each other, not have one standardized practice. But how do we also share cool things that we've learned from each other? Like our group tried the scheduling this way, or our group tried this in our meetings and it helped us trust each other more, or our group oriented new people this way so that they could fully participate. Because right now it's actually pretty hard to get into left movement work. And there's a lot of barriers, both because of perfectionism and purity politics. Like if you don't know the right words, you might feel like you can't join. And because we don't necessarily reach out to bring in lots of people who are like scared or angry, or, you know, ready to be mobilized, but are being basically misled to just like post on the internet or wait to vote or just go to a march once a year. We really want people to build like thick relationships to social movement, and mutual aid is that way in. So we need to change the culture of our orgs to bring in a lot of people. Not when you're doing the most sensitive illegal mutual aid work maybe, but when you're doing a lot of the bread and butter mutual aid work that so many orgs are doing. So I just wanted to name that as well.
Okay, so we are in the process of switching ASL. It's currently 5 o'clock. I will remind everyone that we advertised this is a 60-minute conversation, which, if you know any of our three panelists, was clearly a lie. However, we have a hard stop at 5:30 Pacific. So I have two questions, and I am going to just acknowledge that I am being, again, the internet overlord. So one is mine. What about college campus communities? How do we take these lessons on as members of college campuses that often see themselves? And I mean, looking at you, Dean, but also looking at UW, you know, we see often these private schools as separate from the rest of the city, or we see UW as being too fancy for the rest of Seattle. How do we think about being accountable to our city communities? And second is a riff off of Guy's question in the chat, which is essentially, we would like for mutual aid to be a horizontal effort. How do we do that while acknowledging that there are power imbalances between who can participate and where we come from? Would love for any and all of the three of you to answer either or both of those questions.
Dean, why don't you start?
Okay. You know, I actually think college campuses are like an ideal place for people to be practicing specifically abolitionist mutual aid tied to these cops off campus campaigns. In so many ways. I mean, one thing is just, what is it our campus, what are the police supposed to be doing on our campuses? It's like, at my school, my students' research showed that they police a lot of drug and alcohol use. We all know that policing is not an appropriate response to drug and alcohol use and doesn't make people safer. So what kinds of peer-based things do our students need? If they demand getting rid of the campus police and they demand that SU cut ties with the Seattle Police Department, what also do they want? Like, they might want more campus mental health from the mental health center, but they also might want peer-based mental health, or groups of survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault to have space to meet and form strategies together to make the campus safer and to make their lives safer. They might want to do that kind of stuff integrated with all the people living around the campus. Our campus is also a space where our campus police harass people from the neighborhood walking through, including poor and homeless people. So all of that, you know, kind of collaborating about the space we're in and the ways policing works in it and what safety we could actually imagine and what's harming and endangering people on our campus who are part of the campus because they work or go to school there, or because they live near there. And yeah, so one of the things I've been trying to help my students move towards is thinking more about self-generating safety together instead of just being consumers of the school. Like, campus mental health services are probably never going to work for everybody. There's lots of limits to who works there and what models of mental health they use. So we want them to be robust, but we might also want some options that work for people who don't want to go through a traditional mental health route. And we might want the school to respond to sexual violence in a certain way, but it's actually using a really punitive policing model. So what other models would we want to put in place in a grassroots way? It's very parallel to what's happening at the level of city abolition, activism, and mutual aid, and a great place to practice all of that that's immediately supporting people's well-being. And I think the question, this is Vital Guy's question, and this is a lot what the second half of the book is about. It's like, yeah, we are bringing us to mutual aid work. We're bringing all of our programming in these social roles, all of our family group programming and the roles we take on because of that. There isn't going to be a way that we can work together and not encounter conflict that is vital and important. And so it's not about like trying to create something that doesn't have that. It's about like building tools and skills for working together within that. And actually there's a lot of like deep, mostly women of color, feminist tools that have been developed for decades about how to do a lot of that stuff in groups, including through the transformative justice framework, but also others. And so that's what I think most of us are turning towards. Like, how do we create participatory spaces where people can work across lots of differences? How do we like be rigorous and dedicated to self-awareness and to producing conditions of deep participation and co-stewardship? We don't have any practice at that usually if we've been like in schools and jobs and nonprofits and the existing kinds of spaces that that we're used to. And so but we're not alone in imagining that, and there's so many beautiful, interesting models, none of which are perfect and all of which offer us inspiration. So I tried to include some like leads on that in the book, but I think that many of us are like kind of lifelong students of different ways people are trying horizontalist models. But there is no group without intra-group difference. All groups have differences within them, and so there's no way to get away from that. Even if we have some specific population we're part of that we're working in primarily, there's still differences. And so it's not like a stopping point. It's just like sober awareness of the reality that these are the conditions under which we'll always be working.
I'll jump in, which is to answer the question that Megan posed about, and just building on what Dean was saying about mutual aid and the Cops Off Campus movement. Angélica was part of the Decriminalize Seattle movement, and one of the things that they really put into public consciousness and really used as a way to shift the city council away from its historic ways of operating and to even just question itself was that they posed the question of, what does safety really look like? And then but even before that question, they said, do police make us safe? We've been told that there's some kind of linkage between policing and safety, and we've just accepted that false linkage. And in fact, for many people on our campus, for Black students, for Indigenous students, for gender nonconforming students, they clearly know that cops are not the basis of our safety. In fact, you can feel and experience more lack of safety, more vulnerability, differentiated vulnerability from having their presence on campus. So I think one of the great things about the Cops Off Campus movement and why it's so exciting to see so many students championing this movement right now is that, again, it's calling into questions the categories that we have that have been the basis for a lot of the social structure and the law that we take for granted. So if policing isn't about safety, what is it about? And what could be a more important question for every student to be asking at this moment? And its answer is manifold, and we build new movements to deal with that manifold answer. I think that the question around hierarchies builds on this as well, which is the students at UW who are part of UW-BLM are some of the, they're amazing, and they've been doing such incredible work. And one of the things that they did over the summer is that they moved from thinking of, so they realized that, one, cops on campus don't produce safety. And two, that cops are not just on our campus, they're also on that line that divides campus from not campus. And they oftentimes produce more harm for the people who are not supposed to be on campus than they do for people who are to be on campus, per se, or who are seen as being able to be on campus. And so the UW-BLM did an effort of a mutual aid project for a week at the U District, where they just tried to bring together the resources they had to try to offer it to unhoused people who are oftentimes targets of UWPD. And the part of the reason that they did this was that they wanted to build a relationship with unhoused people in the university district who are more policed than even they are, even as some of them are students of color, most of them. But they don't have relationships to try to figure out how to build a alternative vision of safety in the UW and university districts simultaneously. We need the experiences and the visions of unhoused people if we're to really think about how to deal with harm and safety in the region. And so, as much as mutual aid can have hierarchies that we have to work out, it's also true that movements are oftentimes a mix of class statuses, and that's okay. We need those resources. We need the working poor to be in relationship with the those who've been forcibly ejected from the possibility of work and are poor. We need the working class to connect with the working poor. We have all of these different differences that we can actually bring into useful work with one another if we don't use a charity model for our work.
I think the other thing I would say about the campus stuff is it makes me think about the ways in which so much of our education is educating us into categorizing what is considered a crisis and what is not. So very few of our classes, maybe with the exception of Chandan's, really name capitalism as the crisis. And so the cops off campus work to me, and the thing you're talking about right now, Chandan, about the BLM students also looking at the houseless community in the U District and saying, oh, that is actually a site of crisis. That is a priority, and not just something where, I know anyone who's in the UW, somehow they have my phone number and I get a text being UW danger alert, of somebody's been robbed on this street. And I'm what is that supposed to do for me? It doesn't produce safety for me to know that there's been an altercation between people who are probably living without a home on the streets outside of UW. I'm just imagining an alternative universe where we're getting those kinds of alerts for oh my God, there's 10 houseless people on campus. How can we get them housing? What would it look like to just flip those? I feel so much of the mutual aid work is just educating you to look at crisis in a different way and to see what crises are acceptable and which ones have been framed as acceptable for so long. And so I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of 911, what constitutes an emergency for 911. If my house burns down right now, hopefully it won't, I could call 911 and the fire department would show up. But if tomorrow I'm out on the street because my house has burned down, there's not a 911 I can call to say hey, me and my kids, my parents are now out on the street. That's not a thing, right? That's an acceptable crisis for the city of Seattle. And so I think we also want to think about what are acceptable crises for the university, things that we've just sort of naturalized, and what can student activism particularly do to expose those and push back on those and link those to the ways in which movements against policing and other ways of making crises acceptable in the city are also pushing back on the city and county and state level right now.
There's a question that maybe I'll just pose, Dean. It's from Mayumi Alino, and it says, I don't think mutual aid and dismantling systems of oppression are incompatible, but how do you balance those actions? Because as mentioned before, the state is inefficient in addressing our needs, but at the same time, we just can't substitute for it either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all social movements that build any people power use mutual aid. Like, it's not like it's the question, are we going to do it or not? It's just like, if you're doing work if you're building a social movement, it's because you're, I mean, on the left or whatever, you're trying to address like real crises, and you can't do it without also like, you're of course like, you're just always addressing the immediate needs while you go. So it's like, and of course there's a lot of scarcity. That's that state imposed scarcity, like we've been talking about, you know, and so it can feel like, oh my God, it's so overwhelming. There are so many people in these cages, and there's so much poverty. But I think a lot, you know, one of the resources I really recommend is Harsha Walia's book, Undoing Border Imperialism. And she talks about this group, No One Is Illegal, which has chapters across Canada and has been working to end border enforcement. And they do a really interesting combination of individual support around individual people facing deportation or other immigration enforcement. And a lot of that is direct action work. Like, the example I love is that when they shut down the international terminal of the Vancouver airport to stop the deportation of this guy, Laibar Singh, and they turned out like 2,000 people in 2008, I think. I really recommend watching the video on YouTube if you need to like have a little lift, because it's so beautiful. So I think part of this is like, we know, as Angélica was describing earlier, that just addressing people's immigration enforcement crises one person at a time, for the lucky ones who have a lawyer, actually doesn't disrupt the system. It doesn't do what collective action can do. So we want people to have that as much as can be provided, but also it's designed to ensure that most people won't get it, right? And that most people will lose anyway because the law is not on their side. So how do we imagine that, like, the real people power building might be direct mutual aid action to stop someone's deportation? That's actually collective action building, that's exposing the system. And not everybody's case is ideal for doing a public action around for various reasons. So this like combination of tactics, where like No One Is Legal also has done focused tactics to try to change whole types of immigration enforcement, to stop them from happening to whole groups of people. And they've done this kind of direct action to support specific people's cases and stop their deportations. And they're doing direct mutual aid. That's not necessarily always the public moment to all these people facing that system. And that combination is really typical. And they're retaining their root causes message of ending border enforcement the whole time. And they also have a very deep, clear message against Canadian colonialism. And so they're always doing deep work in solidarity with Indigenous people in Canada. And so their activities are so grounded in these very radical ideas and don't get, as I'm saying, defanged. But they include like what some people might consider like incremental acts, like trying to stop this thing the immigration system is doing to a person or to a group of people, like some new way of enforcing. And I think that we can just see those examples like all across. And a lot of mutual aid work is like illegal, intense work. Like, you know, I'm thinking about No More Deaths and how their medical camps have been raided recently by the Trump administration's immigration enforcement agents. And like some mutual aid is delivering groceries, and that's vital because we're knowing our neighbors and preparing for the next disaster and knowing how we'll stay connected and saving each other's lives. And some of it is like stuff that is heavily criminalized, and we need to be doing that huge range of work. And I think movements always are, but part of the reason I wrote this book is because mutual aid work is invisibilized on purpose by narratives about social change that just center charismatic leaders, law changes, and kind of like elite solutions like courts, legislation, elections. And so the day-to-day work that like is how people get into movements and is most of what politicizes people and scales up movements, that is disproportionately done by women of color, is hidden. in that narrative. You know, we talk about the speeches that Martin Luther King gave around the Montgomery bus boycott, and we don't talk about the Black women who coordinated the rides, and the basis of their work in anti-rape work. There's just so much, you know, I'm thinking about that wonderful book, At the Dark End of the Street, if people want to learn more about the full picture. But so this is a lot of why it matters to mention mutual aid and to show that it is fundamental to the bolder tactics.
I want to just return to answer this question. I also just want to return a little bit to the prior question about hierarchies in our group and flip it a little bit based on what Angélica was saying, which I found so useful and powerful. And it's to come back to one of the mutual aid project that happened at UW-BLM. One of the things that occurred that day was that the students had created a mutual aid space for people to pick up. This was during the peak of COVID in the summer. I know we're in a new peak. We seem to have the US is peaking all the time now because there is no state. In the summer, they'd create a mutual aid station that had portable sanitary kits for people, as well as health and medical kits, and they had clothing and so on. But they also had a kind of a party space. So there was food and there was an amazing DJ, and then there was a period in which there was just an open mic for people to come and talk about why they were there. And one of the people who spoke was a young woman who said that, you know, she had been admitted to UW, but her family had lost their job right before she was supposed to enroll, and so she couldn't enroll at UW, and then she subsequently became houseless. And she had been living as a houseless person for the last 7 years. And she always saw the UW as a reminder of that violence and that shame. And that she came, and having the space to be on campus in that supportive way, and then telling the story was an incredible relief for her. And it was a transformative moment for her. And I think that one of the things that it did was it reminded everyone that our identities are oftentimes predicated upon the devaluing of others, and we have to make spaces in which we undo that harm that is operating right now. So it can feel amazing to be a student, but the way that the financial order is structured right now around a student, even at a public university, there is no public university anymore, is really part of a structure that devalues other lives. And creating a space in which other lives can have repair, I think this is something that we've really learned from Native movements. And Dean mentions in his book that one origin story of mutual aid is that it really is just Native work. Native people have been doing mutual aid as a part of what it means to be in sovereign communities and even in unrecognized tribes since the last 300 years. And so I do think that there's mutual aid has the power of doing repair and holding people of privilege accountable by coming together to collaborate with each other.
Y'all, the internet overlord has allowed her video to emerge, and the reason why is because we were well beyond our 1 hour. We are approaching our hour and a half, and I wanted to go ahead and give us an opportunity to end our discussion at a timely moment when everyone is in their cozy selves. We've all got our cocoa or whatever we need. I wanted to, again, thank everybody who's brought this discussion together. Before I sign off, do any of the panelists just feel like there's a burning thing that they need to share with the community? Are you sure? Let's all mark this in our calendars as a special, special time and special, special date. because these are three of the most important, amazing folks I know. Always have one last thing to share. Just in case, there have been many links that our beautiful panelists have shared with us on the chat. I've been trying to track some of them. I will also ask them, and anyone who's participating, go ahead and email me at, and I am currently typing in my email address which is myba@uw.edu. Look at me, I know my email address. Feel free to send me links, resources, whatnot, and I will send those out with whatever version of a recording of our discussion that I was able to capture using the most cheap version, which is hopefully the most accessible for all of you. What I want to share again is Dean's book is amazing. And I saw one question. Yes, Angélica. Okay, so I saw one question that was like, why this book? Why now? And the answer is like, it's not this book and now. This is the culmination of decades of work, decades of struggle, decades of coming together to do imperfect work with imperfect people and to love them all the same. Whew. If there's one thing I know, is that work is hard. It is hard to be an imperfect person, to love imperfect people, and to do the imperfect work, and to write a book about why it is worth that struggle. I'm so grateful to Dean for writing that book about those years and years of struggle and what has been learned from that work. I'm so grateful to Angélica and to Chandan for sharing their thoughts on this work and what we can learn from their work, and to our interpreters for real-time captioning and sign language for making those ideas as accessible as possible. Y'all have my email address. Feel free to send me further thoughts, questions, and whatnot.
Megan, could you mention where this will be recorded? Is it going to be posted somewhere like the UW Decrim site in case people go to?
You and your like, I have my things figured out. Okay, two thoughts I have. One, if you are registered for the Eventbrite site, you will receive a link. You may share it freely. Second, as Chandan has mentioned, there is a website that I may or may not run. It is decriminalizeuw.com. I will post it there on the blog once it's up on YouTube, AKA as soon as I figure out how to do that. So give me 1 to 2 days and I will do that. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your patience as I learn how to manage my technical work in the most accessible way possible.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks, Dean, for your amazing book.
Thanks all for being here. So good to see you.
Bye, everybody.
Read the book if you haven't already. It's small, it's short, it's cute.